session of Sattology with a very prominent academic, very known world over, and he has published books, authored books. He has been recognized for his service to academics and history, particularly cosmology, and his views have been respected and accepted across a wide spectrum. So, without delay, introducing you to Sri Subhash Kak from US. Welcome, Subhash Kakji.
Thank you, Aditya ji. Glad to be on your show.
It's a pleasure to have you, and it's a real honor to see that how academically you have been influential in bringing forth the Vedic science concepts in American universities. So, can you briefly tell us what inspired you to focus on Vedic science aspect of Vedic history?
Okay, it's a very interesting story. In the mid 80s, I was working on AI, and the specific problem was machine translation. And I was reminded that when I was young, my father used to tell me about this amazing grammar of Sanskrit by Panini called Ashtadhyayi, which had expressed all the rules of Sanskrit in just 4,000 formulas or 4,000 rules. And now, in all machine translation problems, the question is how to represent the grammars of the source language and the target language effectively, so that you can then go from one expression in one to the other. And this took me, so I was so intrigued. I wanted to find out what was more about Ashtadhyayi. And I was shocked to realize that the standard histories of Vedic science or Indian science was that there was no science in India before the coming of the Greeks. And prior to that, whatever there was sort of very rudimentary, not equal to what the Babylonians or the Greeks had. Now, clearly you could not, in fact, to add to it, it was even believed that Panini created his grammar, his complicated grammar, which is equivalent to a computer program. In fact, consider Panini to be the father of programming, to the extent that it's a program with rules as well as rules about rules, which is what you have in a computer program. So the standard history books said that there was no writing also at the time of Panini. So the question arises, if there was no writing, why would somebody from the blue, out of the blue, create something as intricate as that? Because everything in science occurs in a social context. So this prompted me to investigate the whole question of science in the Vedic or Indian tradition. And I went back from language, which is of course Panini, to the astronomy, then to the various layers of Vedic literature, which, as you know, the most from recent to the most ancient, you have the Siddhantas, the Sutras. Before that, you have the Upanishads. Before that, you have the Aranyaks. Before that, you have the Brahmanas. And before that, you have the Vedic Vedas. And then you also have Upavedas and many other Vedangas and many other auxiliary sciences. So what was very clear to see that here was a very complex and rich structure. And as I investigated it, I discovered a long forgotten astronomy associated with the Vedic ritual. And I wrote research papers on it, both for Western journals and Indian journals. And one thing led to another. And eventually I got into a whole range of the sciences that were practiced in ancient India. And what I discovered was absolutely extraordinary. And it has sort of engaged me for many years. But I'm happy to tell you that it's also not only been published in scholarly journals both in the West and India, but it's also been represented in a lot of encyclopedia articles. And for example, Encyclopedia of India, which was edited by this professor from UCLA, has 18 articles on all of this, and this came about in 1992 or something. So there's a lot of stuff that I've been able to ultimately do.
It's remarkable. I read some of your articles, and one thing that strikes me, especially when Indians are trying to work on ascertaining the timelines of Mahabharata and Ramayana, astronomy plays a big role, and it's all mathematics. And when people say that numbers are very recent, so yesterday I was reading an article which said that we used to say numbers in words, ek, do, teen. We may not have written as form of numerals, but the counting was always there because we have calculated yuga. So how accurate is astronomical science than the archaeological science? Because we had K.K. Mohammed spoke to us, and he told us there are drawbacks in archaeological evidence or timelining of past events, and that's why the age of Vedic science is considered very debatable, or the Vedic history. So how accurate is astronomical science in calculating the age of the past events?
You have to have different kinds of interlocking evidence. You can't just depend on the text, because how do you know that the texts are accurate, in the sense that there have not been interpolations? And also, when you are looking at text, there is the matter of interpretation of what you're reading, because it's not normally given as a direct astronomical reading, excepting if it is a astronomical text. For the Vedic period, there is a text called Vedanga Jyotish, which is on the movements of the sun and the moon, and it is written explicitly for people to find out when exactly some tyohars, some rituals have to be performed. Now, the internal date, and these internal dates are determined because the Earth has precession, and therefore it points to different stars, and also in different ages, and also the seasons shift about one nakshatra in 1,000 years. Or if you're looking at rashis, then they shift one rashi in about 2,000 years, because there are 27 nakshatras and 12 rashis, right? Rashis are according to the circuit of the sun, nakshatras are according to the circuit of the moon. So given all of this, there are a lot of astronomical references because of this precessional changes that occurred, that can help us date certain texts to different times. For example, there is a statement in the Shatapatha Brahmana, which is a later text, which says that the Kritikas don't swerve from the east, or something to that effect. And that astronomically is about the beginning of the second millennium BC. And there are certain other references. In fact, in 1893, Bal Gangadhar Tilak wrote a very famous book called The Orion, where he interpreted the references to indicate that the Vedic Samhitas remembered events of the fourth millennium BC. So we do know the references go to about 4,000 or 32, 33, 3,500 BC. And then you have a whole uh, layered system of texts. And as you come to the more recent texts, you find that these astronomical references become more and more recent. For example, the Brahmanas, I said, was probably the second millennium BC. And after that, the Aranyakas and the Upanishads are probably the late second or first millennium BC, and the sutras come later. Now, in addition to this, you also have calendrical references and references that the Greeks, when they came to India, tell us about Indian king lists. Now, the most popularly known ancient Indian calendar is, of course, Kali Yuga, which goes back to 3102 BCE, which is about 5,000 years ago. But in reality, there is another calendar which people don't know very well in India, which is called the old Saptarshi calendar, and which goes back to about 6676 BCE. That is almost 9,000 years prior to us. And how do you know what's the evidence for that? Well, it so appears that the Saptarshi calendar, which began in 6676 BCE, was later on uh, um, changed to 3076 BC, 3076 BCE, and it's still used in Kashmir. For example, in Kashmir, when a horoscope is drawn, it's drawn with respect to the new Saptarshi calendar. I still remember my father's horoscope. He was born in 4993 of the Saptarshi calendar. So now, how do we know that there was an older one which went to 6676 BCE? Well, when the Greeks came, they speak of king lists, which are 4,400 years at their time, which was about 300 BC. So, which takes us back to no 6,000. So, well, in any event, I've written on it. So it does take us back to 6676 BC, which is 3,600 years in addition to 3076 BCE that I already mentioned. So we have all of these references. Then we have archaeological record, and as we know, the archaeological record in the so-called Sindhu Saraswati tradition goes back to about 8-9,000 BCE, and one of the earliest sites in Haryana, where in fact they even found a potsherd with the drawing of the famous dancer from Mohenjo-daro, a world famous dancer pose with one arm on the hip. So this is the archaeological tradition is totally continuous, goes back to 8-9,000 BCE at least, and we find continuity in art, continuity in other practices in jewelry, and certainly when we go to the main sites of the Sindhu Saraswati tradition, apparently whatever you can estimate of how religion was practiced is all continuous. Now there is another archaeological branch which goes to cave paintings or rock paintings or rock art, which takes us where one of the earliest site is Bhimbetka near Bhopal, and it's been estimated variously to go from 10 to 20,000 BCE or even earlier. And how they look at earlier, because apparently the ostrich became extinct in India 40,000 years ago, and there is some knowledge of the presence of ostrich there. And then there are other rock arts also in Maharashtra and elsewhere, which are also quite ancient. So there is a lot of stuff. There is literary references and language changes. So literary references, there is archaeological references, there is art, and then of course there is astronomy. And so all of these things in astronomy, you also have um, in Burzahom in Kashmir, for example, some unique astronomical events which occur very rarely, like supernova and so on. Now, of course, there is a certain estimation involved or certain guesswork involved. But basically what happens when you're looking at old history, you have to look at different kinds of evidence and see how they gel together.
That's right.
And all of these things do gel together, and they give us, as I mentioned, a continuous record which go back at least 10,000 years and more likely many more thousands of years.
No, you stand out as a person, a historian, and also a computer scientist. You stand out from the rest of the crowd, where you are trying to uh, give a scientific meaning to what everything has happened and focus more on the scientific methodology. Don't you think that the ancient Vedic rishis and other people were also the scientists? Like in modern context, if you are living in the Vedic time, you will be called a rishi. Instead of a doctor or something, you'll be called a rishi. Don't you think that the science and the spirituality was one and the same thing?
Of course, yeah, yeah. Now, let me begin also with the very etymology of the word rishi. Rishi, as you know, is similar sounding to the word for bear, riksha. Riksha is the word for bear. And why riksha and rishi, the similarity is because the bear goes into the cave for several months and then comes back. So likewise, the rishi went and did tapas wherever, whatever the method of sadhana was, and turned inwards. And clearly, the inner sky and the outer sky, and this is, of course, one of the very heart of the whole Vedic approach to reality. There is a certain connection. So if you look within, you can also make sense of the without. So certainly the rishis were scientists. In fact, every scientist is inspired. Any true scientist is inspired because if you're only looking at surface data, you cannot have that deeper intuition about what the data means. In fact, in the Vedic texts or in one of the Aranyakas, there is this famous thing, uh, who does the seeing? It's not the eyes. Who behind the sight? Who's doing the seeing? Behind the hearing? Who's doing the hearing? Behind the ears? Who's doing the hearing? Because just the instrument of seeing and the instrument of hearing does not bring understanding to you. So what the rishi was able to do um, was to turn inwards and find this deeper pattern related to the nature of our outer reality as well as inner reality. Because the Vedas are, of course, Atmavidya. They are about the science of consciousness. But what the Vedas say that there are two kinds of knowledge. One is apara, and the other is para. Apara is outer knowledge, which is what you obtain through your senses, and that's all the sciences that you're taught, for example, sciences or the arts and the humanities or whatever else you are taught in the university are apara, because we describe them through language and through other modes of expression that human beings possess. But the science of consciousness itself, the science of knowing itself, that is paravid, because you cannot turn the searchlight of consciousness onto itself in any obvious manner. And that is the um, deep science that the Vedic texts are most concerned about. The Vedic knowledge is not in conflict with outer knowledge, because the outer knowledge and Vedic knowledge are complementary to each other.
That's right.
And Vedic knowledge is what drives all of outer knowledge also, because if you talk to the greatest scientists in the world, they would tell you that they arrived at their understanding sort of spontaneously. Or you have a great mathematician like Srinivasa Ramanujan saying, and he's expressed this many times, that the goddess Namagiri would come to him in his lucid dreams and dictate the formulas, and he would wake up and write them down, and that's why he could not explain where his formula came from. So It's a beautiful system, and certainly the Vedic rishis, what they created. Uh, uh, you have the various sutras, Sankhya or Vaisheshika, etc. And even the sutras go back to 500-600 BC, according to the most conservative chronology. For example, Vaisheshika sutras of Kannada has the most amazing and sophisticated approach to the nature of outer reality. So it says that as far as the properties of all the outer aspects of reality, which is the physical world, are concerned, they can be obtained only through three things, namely substances, their qualities, and their motion. There's no magic here. And as far as our understanding of this outer reality is concerned, that in our minds emerges from three principles: the universal, the particular. Particular is Vishesha, which is where from Vaisheshika comes from. And the third is Samavaya, which is where the human mind interacts with the outer reality. And so it's absolutely sophisticated, beautiful, speaks of four kinds of atoms, two of which have mass and two of which do not have mass. Now, you might say it's just a coincidence because the modern physics that we have, it has also considers four kinds of particles. Maybe a coincidence, and two of them have mass, namely protons and electrons, and two others don't have mass, namely photons and neutrinos. So all kinds of amazing stuff, which the rishis were able to, by diving into the very heart of their consciousness, were able to pull out and then express them in the most, compact language. And it's rather unfortunate that a lot of the Indians do not know Vaisheshika Sutra. A lot of people do read the Brahma Sutras, or Vedanta is quite a popular thing, and Nyaya is logic, and yoga is become popular once again. And then you have Sankhya, and then you also have Vimansa. Vimansa is about tradition and so on, and also logic, and there are also certain rules. So out of all of these, I would hope that more Indians, scholars and others would read Vaisheshika Sutra much more carefully, because it's amazing stuff. And I did translate it 3 or 4 years ago uh, from a scientific perspective. And it's a book called Matter and Mind, which is available all around the world. And you can even get the uh, electronic edition for only 99 cents. I'm doing some sales here.
No, you're allowed. This is your channel, and Sattology is mostly academic discussions here we have, and which have some, because academics have direct relevance on our practical lives. People think that philosophy is abstract and can be dry, but when you put the same philosophy in action, then it becomes the most relevant thing. The dry work can become very interesting. Now, coming back to the last point you made, uh, about the atoms, and it just comes to my mind. I'm a student of Bhagavad Puran, Trisarenu, and the calculation of the movement of the sun particles in the sun rays and how much distance. And I actually experimented that, and I could match the time on my clock, and more accurately down to the second. So all those sciences are already written, and like you just said, Vaisheshika, and you made a very strong point. I'm going to buy a book. Uh, the the concept of time calculation, which is purely atomic in our scriptures, and the atomic clock seems to be a little bit behind on that one. So what do you? So these are some scientific discoveries. So what is your viewpoint on using Vedic science concepts more as compared to the modern materialistic sciences? Many science students are watching this show right now. So please.
Well, what the Vedic texts tell us, and when we say Vedic texts tell us, clearly some rishi tradition, parampara, they had looked at all of these questions. So they had this systematic division of time, both minute, division of day into 30 muhurtas, then 30, each muhurta into 30 parts, each into further 30, 30, 30, and so on. And you, for example, had Nimish or Nimesh, which is 16th by 75 of a second, if you were to convert it into second. And I mentioned this since you did speak of light, because there is this famous statement by Sayanacharya. Sayanacharya was a polymath. He was also the prime minister in the court of the Vijayanagar Empire, 1390s or so. He was the younger brother of the great rishi, modern rishi Vidyaranya, who
Vidyaran.
truly redid, revitalized the Vedic tradition in India. So, in what Sayanacharya did, he wrote a commentary on the Vedas, on each of the hymns. So, in the hymn to Surya, he mentions, O Surya, you who travels at the speed of 2,202 yojanas in half a nimesha, and then this and that. So nobody paid any attention to it. And as you know, Max Mueller was responsible for bringing many texts that he could lay hands on indirectly because he never visited India, from India, and get an edition printed. So these texts were quite old, and nobody paid any attention to it until about 30 or 40 years ago. Somebody in Pune said, well, what does it really mean? 2,202 yojanas in half a nimesha. Yojana is almost it's a well-known measure according to Arthashastra. I think it's 8,000 bow, dhanush heights. And people claim that a yojana is based on all of this, about 9 or 10 miles. And Nimesha is 16 over 75th of a second. So this gentleman, I forget his name, made a calculation, and he discovered, to his absolute astonishment, that 2,202 yojanas in half a nimesha is exactly 186,000 miles per second, or 300,000 kilometers per second, which is the speed of light. And so it's astonishing, because clearly there were no telescopes in India 600 years ago. So when I heard this, I thought, well, I should go into the very heart of it and find out what's going on. Is it a forgery? Did somebody introduce this in one of the commentaries by Sayanacharya, just to impress the Westerners that Indians knew what the speed of light was? But no, that was not possible, because there are many Sayanacharya manuscripts in different libraries in India. So it was not one of those, bad manuscripts that had come. And then I went back to the Puranic texts like Vayu Purana, Vishnu Puran, and many of these Puranas also have chapters on Jyotish. And I discovered that the speed of the sun, because the sun moves across the sky and you can associate a speed with it, was 1/18th of 2,202. So this was really a very ancient number, exactly 1/18th. And nobody had paid any attention, because in these Puranas, now once again, this is truly astonishing, the distance to the sun that is given is 15.7 times 10 to the power 6 yojanas. And since we do know how far yojana is, it's exactly the true distance. And Vayu Puran is at least 500 CE, if not older. In fact, if you go back to the Upanishads and the Aranyaks, they do mention Itihas and Purana. So the earliest Purana must have been several centuries BC. But in any event, we do have reference to Vayu Purana being recited about 500 CE, only 1500 years ago. So these are very ancient numbers. So the question is, how did they come by these numbers? Did they just see it in their mind's eye, as modern great uh, scientists also claim that these things come to them in a flash, right? And in fact, about a month ago, this Englishman came to me, meaning he emailed me. He says, Professor Subhash, I'm very interested in your paper that you wrote 20 years ago on 2202 Yojanas in half animation. It's on archive, arxiv.org, which is where all scientific papers are archived. So he says, well, I have this idea, maybe there was some actual observation that the Vedic rishis made, which would explain how they arrived at the speed of light. So he sent me a draft paper. It's very interesting. But the only problem was that he was assuming that a synchronized system of clocks existed in India. So he was saying that here was one Jyotishi sitting in Ujjain, another was sitting in Bengal. So I told him, so look, you have an interesting idea, but there was no system of synchronized clocks. The only thing that existed in all of ancient world was local time. People knew when the sunrise was, when the sunset was. And so he was very thankful to me. He says, well, I would have made a big mistake. So, but can we do something else? Can we understand all of this? And there may be some way of understanding if we don't know without the need of telescope. And in fact, this gentleman and I are sort of investigating this. And we are also investigating this mystery of how the distance to the sun was so accurately known. And it was nowhere near this estimate anywhere in Greek astronomy, in Babylonian astronomy, or even in European astronomy. Before the invention of the telescope, first of all, there was no idea of what the speed of light was. And in fact, Newton thought that light had infinite speed. It was Romer, I think in 1675, who estimated speed for the first time by looking at the satellites of Jupiter. So how is it that in India, you had this amazing knowledge, and certainly nobody at this point, although right now, together with this Englishman, we are looking at all kinds of explanations for how the distance to the sun could have been estimated. But I must also tell you, and your listeners would be interested, that very early on, this is what I discovered in 1993 itself, that the Vedic rishis knew that the sun and the moon were each 108 times their diameters away from Earth, respectively. That the sun is 108 times the sun diameter away from the Earth. The moon is 108 times the moon diameter away from the Earth. When we say 108, we don't mean exact mathematical. We mean, 107.107 to 109, somewhat. And, these things are not exactly circular. But it's incredible, and it is true. And modern astronomy has also shown us that the diameter of the sun is 108 times the diameter of the Earth. Absolute incredible. And the rishis knew it, and the rishis wanted to focus on the formula Yat Brahmande Tad Pinde, as in the cosmos, so in the pind, meaning the body. So as in the above, so below, right? So just because the outer sun is 108 times its diameter, or 108 units away from Earth, from us, so the inner sun, which is the lamp of consciousness, is 108 units away from our body, which is the Earth. And therefore, you make a symbolic journey to the inner lamp of consciousness, which is inner sun, who you might want to call Shiva or Vishnu or Shakti. And therefore, you have 108 names, the god or the goddess. You're making a symbolic journey from your body, which is your mind, to the inner sun. And which is why you have 108 Tirthasthans, which is why you have 108 Karanas or dance poses in Bharatanatyam. So all of this knowledge was permeated at so many different levels, and people seem to have forgotten it. They had forgotten certainly the meaning of the number 108. And I wrote a book on it and many papers in scientific journals. The name of the book is The Astronomical Code of the Rig Veda, which you might want to take a look at and challenge it if you want, because that's what the whole process of scholarship is about.
That's right. And you gave so much information in this answer that I think people have to watch this video 10 times. Now, one question you have before we wrap up this show is that you have given us scientific explanation based on your own research into what the calculation of time and other things is, which brings me to the point of creation, which is a debated topic almost in all cultures, all faiths, all traditions. And somehow, Vedic culture is the only culture which talks about the sun, the moon, Rasatal, Mahatal, Talatal, Maharloka, Siddhaloka, Janaloka, Tapaloka, all these different ones with accurate measurement of distances. In Bhagavad Puran, if you go and read, the accurate distances mentioned where is sun, where is moon, how far is moon from the sun, and how far. And since you have told me about other calculations, and I can just draw an inference that that must also be true. Maybe the science has not been able to discover it yet. What do you have to say on that, please?
Well, what's interesting is in the 1990s, exoplanets were found for the first time. Exoplanets are other objects in the universe where life could exist, which are planets to other stars. Now, prior to that, prior to the 1990s, there was no mention of the presence of the possibility of life anywhere else because nobody had thought of the existence of exoplanets. Now you have Brahma Vaivarta Puran, for example, which speaks of a limitless number of systems like our solar system. There's a very interesting story there that Indra becomes very proud, and there's a young boy who appears in his court and he's with a shiny face and he's laughing. So Indra gets very angry. He says, "Why are you laughing?" He says, "Look, you see these ants climbing on the wall. They were all Indras of some other system elsewhere at a separate time." This is a story just to make the point, there is an infinite number of such planets where life could exist. So certainly there is amazing stuff related to time, infinity, creation, cycles of birth and death. Clearly the age of the present cosmos or universe is about 13 or 14 billion years, which is corresponds to what astronomers now believe has time has elapsed after the Big Bang. So all of that. But there is even more. There is also that they have these cycles. Then you have, cycles of quiescence, then cycles of creation. And the belief is that all of this creation occurs in consciousness. From consciousness emerges Akasha. From Akasha emerges Vayu. From Vayu emerges Tejas, which is light. So, in other words, if you want to express this in modern language, from consciousness emerges neutrinos. Akasha corresponds to neutrinos, Vayu. From Vayu emerges Tejas, which is light. From neutrinos then emerge photons. From photons emerge electrons because Apas is associated with, or water is associated with electrons. And from electrons emerge protons, which is associated with Prithvi. So there is this whole sequence that there is this creation that occurs. And in fact, there is this another interesting story that Sarah Bernhardt was the most famous actress. She was a French woman of the late 19th century. And in 1898, she threw a party in New York. She was visiting New York, and she brought Swami Vivekananda and Nikola Tesla together. And Vivekananda, and we have record of their meeting through a letter that Vivekananda wrote and through an entry in his diary that Tesla made. And Vivekananda tells Tesla that, look, according to Vedic science, matter and energy are interconvertible. It's because of all that I already told you. And why don't you look for this? Because once you do that, Western or modern science would also be on a more secure basis. And Tesla told him, okay, I'm going to try that. And we do know that Tesla was not successful. And 7 years after that, Einstein wrote his equation E equal to mc square, which had in fact earlier also been written up on by others, but Einstein became famous. But there's at least one story which has not been for which we don't have clinching evidence. And the story is that Tesla was the most famous Serbian guy of the late 19th century, most famous scientist. And Einstein's wife, first wife, was a Serbian. And that she had written to Tesla asking for, ideas, what should I work on? And Tesla told her that this is something that I'm working on. This is something that you should work on. If the story is true, this will also be a connection between Vedic science and Einstein and relativity and nuclear weapons and all the rest that modern science is about.
Thank you so much. And you gave me a punchline for this video. Consciousness builds other consciousness. So life comes from life. So you gave me a punchline in your talks, and it's a wonderful, wonderful conversation we had. I'm going to drill you down into subsequent videos or discussions we have into cosmology, the Vedic cosmology, and the Vedic time calculation. And the way you have put it in the context of neutrons and protons is very heartwarming. I've heard your videos, but heard you directly from you. So very grateful to you for having come here. So this video will go live on coming Saturday morning, and viewers keep watch out for the post-production video, and thank you for watching it live as well. So coming back with Shri Subhash Kakji, also Padma Bhushan or Padma Shri from India, and he is it was just a percentage show of how much he knows. And thank you all. Namaskar.
Thank you. Thank you, Aditya.